From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
News from the John Durham trial of lawyer Michael Sussmann as the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign says that Hillary Clinton herself approved the leak of false information about Donald Trump's ties to a Russian bank. Plus, Donald Trump says Dr. Oz, his candidate in Pennsylvania's Senate race, should declare victory even before all the votes are counted. In a preview of Tuesday's, that is coming Tuesday's, big primary day in Georgia. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, here with my esteemed colleagues, Kim Strassel and Kate Batchelder-Odell. How are you?
Happy Friday, Paul.
Doing well, Paul.
All right. So let's start with the trial of Michael Sussmann, which got underway this week, and it's been moving at a fairly brisk pace with the prosecution making its case. John Durham, the special counsel who's been investigating the Russian collusion origin story, and is continuing to do that. And he has indicted Michael Sussmann for lying to the FBI when he told the FBI that he wasn't representing anyone, when he told the FBI about the alleged ties between the Trump campaign and Moscow's Alfa bank. Now, the big story this week so far is what was told by Robbie Mook, the Clinton campaign manager in 2016, Kim, disclosing that, in fact, Hillary Clinton had approved the release of the information to a reporter. And that reporter then went on to make that public. What's the significance of this?
Well, this is the first time Hillary Clinton has ever been dragged into this. Her campaign team up until now, over all these years, has been very careful to shield her from any suggestion that she knew either about these Alfa Bank allegations or the dossier that the campaign also funneled to the FBI. And I think what's notable here is not just that her name is surfaced for the first time, but also the operation that was revealed as part of this, which is that the Clinton campaign essentially gets these data researchers together to concoct the notion that Trump had a secret connection with Alfa Bank. They give it to the campaign. She greenlights to give it to the media, even though Mr. Mook testified that the campaign wasn't 100% certain of the accuracy of it, not confident of it at all, hadn't vetted it itself. They give it out to the press. And then the minute the press runs with the story, they tweet it out and make it sound as though this is just a revelation from somewhere else.
Oh, golly, how did that happen? And it's kind of amazing. Just to underscore your point, Kim, here's the tweet from Hillary Clinton back in 2016, which retweeted a statement by Jake Sullivan of the Clinton campaign, pointing to the story in Slate, which had been leaked by the campaign.
To Slate.
To Slate. And here's what she said. Hillary Clinton says, computer scientists have apparently uncovered a covert server linking the Trump organization to a Russian-based bank. You got to love the apparently in that sentence, doing a whole heck of a lot of work. But I mean,
computer scientists that we retained.
Yeah. I mean, so you have the campaign ginning up a false story, then just giving it to the FBI, then the press writing about the story, saying the FBI is investigating, if I recall, then the campaign issuing a statement on the story without disclosing its own role in that story, and then the candidate tweeting the statement. You have a completely circular, dirty trick.
Yeah, and just to point out, too, the level of deceit here. People dig up opposition research on their opponents all the time, but you'd at least like to hope it has some element of truth. And sometimes they'll hold it to release it. Remember the DUI revelation with George W. Bush. Okay, that was true, but this one, they concocted it entirely themselves. It was their own team that came up with it and just made up this whole allegation, and then not only gives it to the press, gives it to the FBI. And one of my favorite parts of all of this is the prosecutor asked Robbie Mook to explain the definition of an October surprise. And he testified, well, it's the idea that you have this devastating piece of opposition research and you drop it on a candidate so the candidate doesn't have time to respond or recover from it. And then the prosecutor said, could you read out the date of that tweet?
What date was it?
31st.
October 31st.
October 31st.
So classic, just a classic. Kate, I mean, you've been around Washington. The insularity of this whole thing and the interbreeding, the interactivity here between the press, the lawyers representing the campaign, and all of this, I mean, you just want to say, I mean, my reaction to this is you can't believe a single thing that you read that comes out that's related to this kind of political accusation.
Yes, Paul. And to add to the insularity, the tweet from Hillary Clinton, which, as you noted, is about a week before the election, includes quotes of very concerned advisor named Jake Sullivan, who's now working in the Biden administration. And Jake Sullivan says in this statement, this line of communication may help explain Trump's bizarre adoration of Vladimir Putin and endorsement of many pro-Kremlin positions. So he has been implicated in this as well. And I think the insularity is an important theme here because we saw some testimony in the trial this week from James Baker, who's the general counsel of the FBI at the time. And he says this week that, if he had known the client of Sussmann, he would have been more suspect of it because it would have potentially dragged them into a political fight, but also that they were urgently wanted to look into this so before the press got to it. And so this is part of the whole story, right, is that playing the press and the law enforcement officials against each other, because if you take these allegations to law enforcement and then the press reports on them, it looks like they are more serious, even if the underlying details may not be legitimate.
That's a very important point, Kate, a very important point, because if you're sitting there as a reporter and you are somebody from a political campaign comes to you and says, hey, I got this big data dump, any respectable reporter is going to try to confirm it. But then if they can say, oh, by the way, Kate, you know that the FBI is really looking into this? You go, oh, well, there must be something more serious there. Is it a certain more gravitas, even if the whole connection to the FBI was itself concocted? Kim.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, to your point, a key. And this is also, remember, what they did with the dossier, too. They funnel the dossier to the FBI, and then they, begin to sort of toss it around to the press. Now, in that particular case, we now have evidence that was introduced in this trial that a lot of the press kept hands off on that. And in fact, and indeed, the revelations about the dossier did not end up going public with BuzzFeed until January of 2017. But by this point, there had now been so much press reporting about FBI investigations, etc., that it allowed the press to just run with the dossier story. And it's really remarkable how good they were at this, the Clinton campaign, given that we also know that there were huge doubts within the FBI about the substance of the Alfa allegations. In fact, Baker testified that within a couple of days, they had largely discounted them and discredited them, even though an investigation went on for much longer than that. And they had suspicions about the Clinton campaign's involvement in this, but the FBI marched ahead nonetheless, and then the press ran with it, and we had how many years? Almost 2 years of Bob Mueller. I mean, this may go down as one of the most successful dirty tricks in the history of modern government.
Yeah, Kate, I wonder, what do you think the mainstream press is going to do in handling this information? Mostly ignore it?
Yes, I mean, I think that's what we've consistent with what we've seen so far. But I do think this trial that we're seeing this week has been something of a public service because it is a narrow question over whether Michael Sussmann lied to the FBI and whether that lie was material. Now, one thing I think that is really remarkable about that is that he sent a text message to the FBI General Counsel saying explicitly that he wasn't acting on any behalf of any client. If it had just been a meeting between the two of them, would have been a much different case. So I do think, even though we're talking about a discrete question here, of whether he materially lied to the FBI, this trial has explained to the public in more plain terms, this was what was going on at that time. And this is how Hillary Clinton, who's tweeting out, oh, apparently this is going on, did know about this information. So I do think there is some ability here for this trial to get information to the public about what was going on, regardless of what the rest of the press may want to do to cover or to not seem as though they were ignoring this, or just it's an embarrassment, right, to have been taken for a ride. And so nobody likes to be in that position.
Well, yeah, their embarrassment about being taken for a ride should be considerable. But on the other hand, there's so much of the press was implicated in running with the false Russian collusion story, not just the Alfa Bank story, but the whole false narrative rooted in the Steele dossier and elsewhere. They're running with that for so long that to, at this stage, essentially say, you know what, that was a big mistake, would embarrass them enormously. Now, I think it would actually enhance the credibility of the press to do that, but I don't see much introspection in any of this, Kim, on the part of the press, and that's why I suspect it'll just downplay this. But I do think that the revelations that we have found in the last 4 years, 5 years now, well, I guess 4 years, but particularly in the last 2 or 3, and since the Durham investigation got going, has been enormously corrosive of public trust in the FBI and in the press. And I think the press doesn't quite appreciate the degree to which that feeds into the ability of Donald Trump to basically argue that people are constantly ganging up on him and in the deep state and in institutions in Washington. And it feeds into the public's mind that you just can't trust the institutions of the United States government.
Right, and feeds into the polarization we have as well, too. It's an excellent point that when folks feel as though there's a concerted effort by those institutions that you mentioned to go after and debilitate one political party in the country, they will understandably reject those institutions and believe that there is corruption in government and in the media. And, you know, the press really, they could have been, and I point this out all the time, it didn't have to be this way. Not at all. If the press had just engaged in even the most basic level of due diligence, and, you know, we are all taught as we are young reporters that one of the first rules is you are supposed to be skeptical of any government official peddling you any story. And if they had done that, and instead of being transcribed all their stories by Jim Comey, even after he was fired, by the way, even after Inspector General reports showed the level of his incompetence or bias, whichever you want to call it, but they allowed themselves to be led around by the nose because they wanted to hate Donald Trump. And yeah, they bear an enormous amount of responsibility for those polls showing people's rejection of any institutional authority anywhere today.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about a little preview of the big Georgia primary next Tuesday and a little primary potpourri when we come back.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with Kim Strassel and Kate Batchelder Odell. Let's talk a little bit about the primary season, which is really heating up, and we still have the result of the Republican Senate primary in Pennsylvania uncertain. After a couple of days, at the latest count, David McCormick, former hedge fund executive, is about 1,000 votes behind Dr. Mehmet Oz, who was endorsed by Donald Trump, the famous Dr. Oz. And there are at least about 8,000 absentee ballots, that's Republican absentee ballots, left to count in the state. And McCormick has been beating Oz in the absentee ballot voting. So it's possible he could still win. We won't know the outcome. I think this is going to go a while. It's close enough that it'll probably go to a recount. The thing here that's quite remarkable, or maybe not remarkable, given it's Donald Trump, but Donald Trump, Kate, has basically said, Dr. Oz, just claim victory. You know, this sounds like it's rigged, you know, and there's still votes to be counted. It's quite extraordinary. What do you think, Kate?
Yes, you would think this would complicate his position of the election having been taken from him before all the votes were counted, but he doesn't seem encumbered by that paradox there. I do think we're headed to a recount because that's what Pennsylvania goes to when it's half a percentage point, and they are right now really, really close. But I do think the risk here is that Trump's wading in here really could give away yet another winnable Senate seat, similar to what we saw in Georgia last year when Trump's election stealing narrative cost Republicans the majority in the Senate. And keep in mind, the Democrats on the Senate went with John Fetterman, who supports Medicare for all and would be a reliable progressive vote. And so I think the risk here is if McCormick does win, that Trump helps them lose another seat. But it is remarkably ironic to watch him say that it doesn't matter whether the votes have been counted and you should just claim victory and move on.
Yeah, well, let's hope Dr. Oz behaves better, whether win or lose. All right, let's move to the Georgia race next week and the whole slate of races in the Republican primary, where Governor Brian Kemp is being challenged in the Senate race by former Senator David Perdue, who lost, as Kate suggested, his reelection campaign in 2021. Let's listen to clips first from Chris Christie campaigning for Brian Kemp. That's the former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. And then David Perdue talking about support from Donald Trump.
former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie with us today. He's been a fighter on the Sunday morning shows for conservative values and fighting for good people in our party, and we're honored to have him today, Governor.
Governor, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be in Canton. Looking forward to Alpharetta. I've been coming to Georgia since 2010 when we helped elect Brian and Nathan Deal and the entire Republican ticket. So we're here to fight for the heart and soul of Georgia. That's what this governor's doing all the time. And I just say this to every concerned Republican out there about your state. We don't need to go find someone to beat Stacey Abrams. I'm sitting next to the guy who already beaten Stacey Abrams. So let's get this done next Tuesday.
Have you checked the statements in the last 30 minutes, the last hour? Trump has never said he's washed his hands of this race. As a matter of fact, that's fake news. That's what the national media wants you to believe. And he absolutely said there was no truth in that at all. I can tell you personally, he is so invested in this. Personally, in his pack. I mean, this is a president that really understands the importance of this race in Georgia. This president understands that if we want a conservative Republican in the White House in 24 and we want to get our Senate majority back in 22, we have to win this governor's race. This is bigger than me, and I think Donald Trump knows that, and that's why he supported me from the very beginning.
Understatement of the year that Donald Trump is personally invested in that campaign. I mean, he's unleashed, more statements against Brian Kemp than anybody else, I think, in the country, including Liz Cheney. So he really, really wants to take down Brian Kemp. Of course, he's bitter because he doesn't think Kemp did enough to help overturn Donald Trump's narrow defeat in Georgia in 2020. And he almost personally recruited David Perdue to run again for governor. But as you look at the polling, the latest Fox poll has Brian Kemp winning by 32 points over David Perdue. Kim, you did a column on this race this week. What accounts for Brian Kemp's strong showing here despite the opposition of Donald Trump?
It's really interesting, and I think it's important because it's potentially a lesson for other Republicans. Brian Kemp is succeeding here despite, as you described, this onslaught of attacks from Donald Trump, who personally recruited an opponent, and he's doing it because he's looking forward. He seems to understand that, at least in Georgia, voters have a lot of other things on their mind other than 2020 election relitigation. And he has the ability to do that and get them focused on other things because he acted. Never forget that in the wake of the election, the 2020 election, and Joe Biden's inauguration, within 2 months, the state of Georgia had passed, its legislature passed an election reform bill that dealt with things like new rules on voter ID and ballot drop boxes. This was designed to reassure some of those voters who were understandably very concerned about all the 2020 voting shenanigans that Democrats had foisted on states across the country. And that, and I think all of Georgia's voters, Republicans, watching the attacks that Kemp and others in the Republican Party suffered because of that bill and standing strong, that was a big thing in his favor. But it's also freed him up to talk about his record, which is actually really good. He's got a great, solid conservative record in the state. The economy is very strong. He was one of the first states to shake off COVID restrictions. He has signed bills expanding school choice, strengthening parents' rights. Just last month, he signed a new law allowing Georgians to carry firearms without a permit. These are the things Republican voters value, and he has been able to make the case for his record.
Another angle on this race, Kate, is that the powers that be in the Republican Party are divided. As we said, Donald Trump is for David Perdue. Apparently, Perdue brought in Sarah Palin to campaign for him here recently. And as for Kemp, we heard that he brought in Chris Christie, but Mike Pence is also favoring Kemp. Pence is going to show up for sure if he hasn't already. And some other figures in the GOP are going for Kemp.
Yes, and I think that's a testament to what Kim was talking about with, for instance, the voting reform law. Kemp took the concerns that voters had about election integrity seriously by looking at their voting practices and shoring them up and making sure that those decreased confidences, which really hurt elections, wouldn't become a recurrent issue in the state. And for that, Joe Biden delivered a speech in Georgia at one of the lowest points in his presidency, in my opinion, given the attacks on that law and basically referring to it as Jim Crow 2.0 for issues like where you can put absentee voting boxes and basically policies that were more liberal about absentee voting than Joe Biden's home state of Delaware. So I think Kemp he's getting a lot of support for having weathered those attacks, like Kim said, but also having taken the concern seriously of voters that they want elections conducted fairly and properly. The other thing I'm finding interesting about the Kemp double-digit primary lead that he has is in that Fox poll we mentioned. If you look at the tabs, 65% of voters says it's extremely important that their candidate can win against the Democrat in November. And those voters are breaking for Kemp by 36 points. And then much lower on the list is the candidate being a strong supporter of Trump, with a quarter of them saying that it's extremely important to their vote. And Perdue wins with those voters by 15 points. So what I think we're seeing there is that voters are able to make distinctions. And we're seeing that a lot of people who voted for Trump are preferring Kemp in this election. And the ability to win is one of those things. Having just watched David Perdue lose an election, I'm sure influenced many, so that they can see. But many voters are seeing Trump have some influence on this, but deciding they're just going to make their own decisions, even if they voted for him or liked him.
Well, on the chances of winning front, Kemp did defeat Stacey Abrams, who will likely is almost certain to be the Democratic nominee again this year. He narrowly beat her. And of course, Stacey Abrams famously said she had had the election stolen in 2018 and was, until relatively recently, was still making that claim. And Brad Raffensperger, who is a Secretary of State in Georgia, who Donald Trump also is trying very hard to defeat in his reelection campaign next week, and there's a challenger from the right against Raffensperger. But Raffensperger wrote for us comparing Donald Trump's claims of the election having been stolen to Stacey Abrams claiming the 2018 election having been stolen. So it's really quite a spectacle down in Georgia. But it looks as if Donald Trump's going to take, probably, Kim, you get the last word, the biggest defeat of this primary season next week.
Yeah, I don't see how you can turn this around. I mean, maybe the polls are way off, but that is such a huge margin. It seems a little bit unlikely. It was notable, that clip you played of Perdue, because Donald Trump has been a little bit more quiet about this race. In fact, in reality, in the last couple of weeks, because he sees where this is going. And it'll be interesting to see how he tries to extract himself from this. Lately, they've been playing up the fact that they have an entire slate of Republicans that they are supporting. So look to him, for instance, to point out that their guy that they're promoting for the Senate race, Herschel Walker, is likely to run away with the nomination on that. They're obviously still going after Raffensperger, and he's in a much closer, tighter race than Kemp, in part because he doesn't have all that built-in ability to talk about a record, and because he was more narrowly in the center of this whole recount fight. Although I think it's important, he's still, up in some polls, appears to be leading. So we may see Donald Trump try to point out that he wasn't defeated in Georgia. But yeah, if this goes down and Kemp wins, it'll be a big black eye.
And the big question, if Kemp wins, what does Donald Trump do in the general election? Does he attempt to undermine him to vindicate his support for Perdue? We shall watch that closely. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for listening. Please send questions and comments to us at pwpodcast@wsj.com, and catch us next week for a daily edition of Potomac Watch.